Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second week of advanced training. So I'll be running this workshop but Lucie will be around in case you have any questions or in case we have a second room that needs a judge for this bar. So this week we're going to be covering something called linear flow. And it's something that I recently discovered that made me quite good at things that I think I'm quite good at, which are matter jumping and having really strong, robust internal argument structure. So loads of people, even those who are experienced with debating, do not know what linear flow is. And it's something quite unnoticed when we make arguments, but it makes a world of difference when the judge is crediting your analysis or when you're trying to find out what's missing for making really, really persuasive argumentation. So I think that I discovered a new way of phrasing what linear flow is or internal argument structure. So hopefully a lot of you, even if you've been debating for years, will benefit from it. So if I can click to the next slide. Here it is. So a lot of you are able to make really basic arguments, but lots of you are also similarly, when I was first starting out, missing a lot of things when trying to hit the higher brackets of speaker points. So here are a couple of reasons why people often suck at making arguments. Number one, lots of significant portions are missing. So maybe it looks like impact. Sometimes people miss framing. Sometimes people miss really crucial logical links that they didn't know they needed to prove. And this is always really difficult to try to get people to fix because you just don't know what you're missing until after the fact when the judge tells you that's why you took the third or the fourth. So I'm going to internal argument structure is not only good for identifying it's not only good for a judge trying to follow your arguments, but it's really good at internally checking what parts you're missing before you even speak. So we'll see that later on. Second part of why people suck at making arguments. It's sometimes really unclear where a point is going. So loads of people will sometimes say really smart things, or they'll say really true things, but I'm as a judge, when I'm listening, I just don't know where the point is going. I have no idea whether or not it links to the emotion. I don't know what the impact of the point is going to be. So basically, I just tune out when someone is making a point, but I do not know the direction that this point is going to go. And so they end up wasting a lot of time because they don't signal to me why this point, why the statement they're making is even important in the context of the debate. Third reason why people suck at making arguments, similarly, lots of time is wasted talking about meaningless details. So a lot of the times, it's unclear where a point is going. Maybe it's because it's actually not going anywhere. So a lot of time, people add details that are just not necessary to making a point persuasive or strategic in the context of the debate. So loads of people just for example, give me pieces of framing that just don't go towards making their point impactful or making their point more persuasive. Sometimes people give me logical links that are completely not crucial to proving that point is true. Fourthly, sometimes an argument is super hard to follow. So sometimes they're jumping from all over the place. First, they tell me, the impact, then they tell me the analysis that leads to that impact, but then they tell me the problem after they've the problem they're trying to solve after they've told me the solution to that problem. So it's really hard for a judge to follow your argumentation if it doesn't have a natural flow to it. So all of this can be really avoided by becoming disciplined in how your argument is presented or internally structured. And I'm going to call this having a clear, clean linear flow. And what do I mean by linear flow? So what is linear flow? Linear flow basically is how your argument gets from the beginning to the end. So it seems a little bit tongue-in-cheek when I say this. And I'll try to explain a little bit more further on and use analogies so all of you can understand what I mean. For linear flow to work, every step along the way from getting from point A to point B is necessary. Every step is getting you closer to the end point of that argument, and you don't make any unnecessary detours or diversions. So typically, even though the flow will look different for each debate in each case, typically it resembles this. First, you tell me the problem that you're trying to solve, or you show me the framing of what the court world looks like. So for example, if it's something like this house wants to implement gender quotas for corporate boards, you tell me the framing or the problem that you face in status quo. So just look, right now, a lot of women face a glass ceiling when trying to go up into the upper stratas or the upper echelons of corporations. Because of this, they're underrepresented in the most powerful positions in many of these businesses and remain a socioeconomic underclass. So that's a problem in the framing that we see in the world today. Then you show me why the problem arises. So you identify like why is it that the problem is there? So you can say just like people have internal biases about what powerful business people look like, and these tend to not be women, for example. Or you say like lots of these networks and promotions are based on old boys clubs that women just aren't privy to. So you identify why that problem arises. Then you show me how this motion makes that problem better or worse. Then you show me why it matters that this change has occurred. So for example, like if you're showing to me like, now like women will be super empowered in the workplace, they now break that glass ceiling. And this means the impact of that is that women maybe achieve higher incomes. Maybe these women in these corporate boards will start making policies that are more favorable to women in the workplace, empowering other women lower down the corporate ladder. And then you show me the weighing at the end. So you show me like, this is the most important impact that in the debate because of XYZ reasons. So many of you, especially if you like movies or especially if you like TV series, understand that this actually really follows what our brains naturally tend towards. So typically in a movie, really good pacing is really necessary. So what you need is a setup, and then you need a conflict, and then you need a resolution, and then you need an ending, right? So this is the same thing. So the problem in framing is the setup and the conflict that you aim to solve. And then the rest of your speech is about how you resolve that conflict, or you just like, maybe that conflict gets even worse, right? And then you show me the conclusion, which is like the impact and a winning. So note, just like in a movie, bad pacing can ruin everything and maybe not leave enough time for a good resolution or a good ending. The same thing is true for an argument. So spending way too much time in the setup or in characterizing conflict means that you have no time trying to resolve that conflict or trying to conclude it to a satisfactory end. So all of you need to be really careful in how you internally allocate time to each of these points. So going further, I try to explain why it is that this flow is the flow that most people follow. So you can't just like rearrange things and have it be just as persuasive a lot of the times. So first you need to tell me, so like often you cannot make an argument unless like a judge knows why you're making it, right? So just a lot of times when you're trying to fix a problem, you need to first tell me what that problem is. So, and then next, when you're analyzing why that problem arises, it helps you set up the next stage. So like telling me like, oh, the reason why women are often underrepresented in the most powerful economic positions is through like internal soft sexism or soft sexist culture in workplaces, or just like old boys networks. That sets you up really cleanly for the next stage, which is to show me why the problem changes to be better or worse. So all your analysis can be targeted at those root issues that you just identified in the prior part, just showing me like, okay, this motion solves the old boys network. So this motion solves like the internal soft sexist culture in corporations. And so it makes it seem like your argumentation is all really targeted to the roots of the problem that you just characterized. And so by doing that, your analysis seems super watertight to the judge. And it seems also super unique and like the definitive delta in the debate. So it's not like it's the necessary thing in order to solve the problem, and no other solution is going to be satisfactory because you show how that motion targets the very root problems of that motion. And so then like, of course, like the ending, like your argument doesn't mean anything unless you tell me what the changes result in and why that matters. So for example, like this house would institute syntaxes. So the problem that you set up is just like, look, loads of syntaxes, like loads of people are smoking and drinking alcohol to the extent that it's detrimental for their health. And lots of these people tend to be like socioeconomically vulnerable people. And then you can say like the reason why the problem arises is because of state failure. The state has failed these people in terms of like, they tend to face a lot of economic pressure that gives them a lot of stress in their lives. And the only means through which they can cope with it is through like things like addictive substances like alcohol or other unhealthy life practices. And the state has disallowed them from accessing any other stress relieving mechanism. Like for example, disallowed them from maybe going to the gym, having access to therapy, etc. And so that's the problem that we have. And then the reason why this motion now solves that is that as the government, we nudge them in the more correct direction. So a lot of these people go for these solutions because they're comparatively cheaper than going to things like therapy, like eating healthy food, etc. By making these like smoking and drinking alcohol more expensive, we target that economic incentive to indulge in things like harmful things like alcohol and cigarettes. The impact is like they get better health outcomes, and then you can do the weighing afterwards. Does that make sense to people? Please pipe up if you have no idea what I'm talking about, or if you want me to re-emphasize the point. So this leads me on to the next part of matter dumping. So loads of people who have seen me speak kind of like, I guess like I think that I can get through lots of material pretty efficiently. And one of the reasons why I can do that is because I do something called tiering my analysis. So what does tiering mean? So tiering essentially means that you give multiple levels of something. So I'm going to show you loads of examples of how you can tier your arguments so they seem super robust. But why should you give multiple levels of arguments? So if you give multiple levels of argumentation that I'll show you later, it's much harder for the opponent to rebut everything that you say. So if you're a first speaker and you give like a bunch of different mechanisms or a bunch of different impacts or a bunch of different actors that all lead to some change in the status quo, like maybe your opponent, if they're good, maybe rebut 2 out of the 3. Then your like second speaker can come up, not only rebut the other person who just came up, but said like, look, they obviously didn't take down everything. And because we still have this one mechanism standing, we obviously at least make the world a better place, etc. Also, it's much more like, you make also much more comprehensive cases that seem to cover different dimensions of the problem. So loads of problems in status quo, unsurprisingly, have many different roots or many different reasons as to why they occur. And so seemingly acknowledging that and showing how you change all those different dimensions makes your case seem really, really comprehensive to judge and even more persuasive. Also, if you're in an opening half, so if you're in an OG or OO, super hard to extend off something like that in a meaningful way if you just give a super comprehensive case. Also, like the same reason as to why loads of problems arise due to a multitude of reasons, the actors involved also respond in a multitude of ways. So it's also important to cover as much as possible in order to be persuasive. Be careful, like I'm saying this to you now, but try not to do this immediately. Like don't try to like deal with 10 actors all of a sudden just because you hear this presentation. Take it slowly. Maybe like if you've only been analyzing one actor in a debate before, analyze 2. Don't bite off more than you can chew, because often what I've seen people do is that they try to handle everything and they just end up analyzing pretty superficially. So how do you do this effectively? There are loads of ways to tier your analysis. So this is one of them. This means giving lots of different mechanisms to solve a problem. So what problems mostly look like this, right? You have a problem. It could arise because of a multitude of reasons. So, you know, you have root 1 of the problem, you have root 2 of a problem, you have root 3. And the way you can show that you comprehensively solve this problem, or you comprehensively show how the motion makes it worse, is that you take each root of the problem and you show how that changes, each root changes. So if we're going back to like, there'll be like examples later, but I'll show you examples later. But like, and then the next way you can tier analysis is that maybe a problem just has one root that you can identify. You show me how that one root of the problem changes in a multitude of ways. So this becomes really evident later on when I give you examples. So this one is, for example, multiple roots to a problem. So here's a problem to identify in the motion, this house would legalize all drugs. You can say like, oh, drug cartels are a really big problem in Mexico, or like a really big problem in lots of Latin America. They murder people. They often funnel their drug profits into really bad things like human trafficking. They often do things like rig elections or intimidate local people. That's a really big problem. So trying to identify why this arises probably has a lot of reasons. So maybe one of them is like, they probably can recruit a lot of really vulnerable young men to be part of their drug network. And once these young men, for example, are drug mules, they'll get caught, they get put in jail. where they become more hardened criminals. The second reason why this is a really big problem is often these drug cartels need to be violent. They often need to do face-offs with the police. They often need to murder people in order for them not to squeal or comply with the police. And because of that, there's just a lot of violence involved with the drug business. And third reason as to why drug cartels are a problem, they use that money from drugs to funnel lots of really bad things. Like, for example, they fund things like forced prostitution, human trafficking, rigging elections, and all of these are really bad. So there's lots of reasons why drug cartels are really strong. And this is how you can change each route. So you can tell me like actually, by legalizing all drugs, drug mules are never put in prison. They never become hardened criminals, and they can never be recruited to do worse things than drug muling, right? So like drug cartels can no longer recruit from prisons. So that route is solved. Then you can say like, because we legalize all drugs, like you just don't need to have face-offs with the police. You don't need to hire security to smuggle drugs anymore. And so just the violence entailed in trafficking drugs just goes way down. Less people die because of the drug trade. Third reason, like people, like because you legalize drugs, probably people would rather buy drugs from like the government-run pharmacy down the street rather than a shady drug dealer that is associated with a drug cartel. And because of this, drug cartels now get less money from drugs that they can funnel into things like human trafficking. And so do you see like how I've identified different roots of the problem, and the way I've made my case really comprehensive is to show how that motion changes each root of the problem to make it significantly better. Cool, so I hope that's clear. Another way you can do this. Now, this is like this one problem that I identified that I showed changes in a multitude of ways with the motion. So I identify one problem. So too few women are represented in the upper echelons of business. This house would adopt gender quota policies in corporate senior management. So I identified the problem, too few women that are powerful business people. And then I identified one root to the problem. Probably it's because like women are discriminated in hiring policies. They often face like hostile work environments. So i.e. just like the root of the problem is sexism. Sexism that's basically incredibly entrenched, right? And now, because I've identified one root of the problem, I can show how the motion can change that one root of the problem. So like maybe like because more women are just put into senior corporate decision-making boards, they can now pass, for example, policy. Women in senior positions are likely going to pass policies that make workplaces less hostile to the presence of women. So this benefits women from lower down the ranks as well. So for example, like, like more women will get paid maternity leave, they're more able to ascend in the workplace because there are just policies that support them. So more women are likely going to be promoted. Second way that this solves the root of the problem, like maybe because men and women both become more normalized to working with and under women in senior positions. So if your boss just looks like a woman, or like the head honcho is a woman, over time, you just become much more used to that fact. And you become less hostile or resistant to, for example, when a woman gets promoted. Or maybe if you become a manager one day, you just say like, hey, my boss when I was 20 was a woman. She did a good job. Let me hire this woman, or let me promote this woman since I'm now a manager, right? So that's another way that you can change sexism. Third way you can change sexism, optics. So like more women, for example, when they have a role model in a really high achieving place, or they're like in a really high achieving place, they now have role models and they know that a place is allocated to them. So they're much more likely to strive for promotions. They're more likely to put themselves out there, leaning in essentially. And because they're much more active in pursuing promotions, pursuing raises, because they now know it's possible to actually succeed, like this also changes how women actively try to pursue those opportunities, making it more likely that women succeed. So do you see how like I identified one root problem, but then there are loads of different ways how that root problem can be solved by the motion. So trying to identify loads of different ways how a single problem can change is really like key to making your case as robust as possible. Cool. Another way you can do this is you can choose to target different actors. So this is the motion. This House would restrict EU development aid to member states with anti-democratic party practices. So here's the problem. Too many states in the EU, like Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, are violating EU principles of political rights. You know, they're rigging elections, they're stacking judiciary. This is just not good. And the reason why this has happened is because populist strongmen who have been elected choose to restrict political freedoms, and they arrest journalists, they stack judiciary, and so on. So you can choose to say like, okay, trying to analyze what then changes in this debate. You can look at different actors involved. So we can say like, okay, people within those countries, right? People within Hungary or Poland or Bulgaria. You can say just like, oh, when you take away development aid from these places, you can say just like people within those countries who no longer get as much money going towards local infrastructure or creating jobs, they just have more resentment towards these strongmen for taking away their material wealth. So if they ever have an election again, they probably will vote the strongman out, or maybe they just take to the streets and just oust this strongman, meaning that anti-democratic practices become far less likely. Or you can look at, you know, another actor, the strongmen themselves. You can say like, you know, now they can, like, strongmen themselves know that they can't just do all these terrible things without facing consequences and then eventually facing backlash from their voter base. They just are less likely going to do this in the terrible excess of doing it now, right? And then finally, you can just look at borderline countries that are kind of doing anti-democratic stuff, but are not as severe. So for example, Greece, it's kind of becoming a little bit bad, but not quite to the extent of Poland, Bulgaria, or Romania. You can say that like, oh, countries like Greece, they probably also get better. They observe Poland and Bulgaria being punished. And so local people know the consequences, are swayed away from populism because this looks like that it could be their future. So by identifying different actors, you can also see how the problem is made better. So the last one is different incentives. So this one is just like how different, like what people are motivated by. So maybe people are motivated by the policy that is around them that supports them. People are motivated by the norms that they exist in. And people are motivated by the optical things they observe, like for example, like women in higher positions. This one is, I just identify different actors in the debate and seeing how they all change. Cool. Now, different contexts. This is to protect yourself from being extended upon. So, for example, this house believes that it is in the interest of dominant organized religions for their leaders to declare more progressive interpretations of traditional dogma. So maybe like you loosen how stringent you are on like dietary practices, or like the acceptability of contraception or same-sex relationships. And so if you're on opening government, you can say like, look, there are just too many people leaving organized religion. And that's because dominant organized religions are just too strict on some of the dogma, and it drives lots of moderates away. You can look at, like, religion exists all over the world. So it's probably really good to analyze how different countries or different contexts it exists in is affected by this motion. So you can just say like, in a developed world, you're going to drive the most devoted away. Because now, like, if you are in America or in the UK and you're super religious, when the Pope, or when a really big influential Muslim figure just comes out and says like, actually, it's okay to do anything now. It's okay to be incredibly liberal with all of our religious practices. Now your like religious beliefs just seem too similar to the secular context that you grew up in, right? It's too similar to the secular society that you exist in. So why are you staying in this religion if it has no comparative difference to the society that exists around you? So you as the most devoted person are probably going to leave, or you're going to be driven away because there's just no comparative value that your religion is adding anymore. So that's the developed world. Not the developing world, right? You can say just like, look, what passes as like really radical in Europe or in the West actually is characterized as pretty moderate in a lot of parts of the developing world. And so it's likely that if you accept all of these like liberalisms in religion, this just becomes way too progressive for even mainstream society to accept. And you're just going to drive loads of moderates away because they're just put off. That's way too different from their social political beliefs. And then, yeah, so like you seem like really comprehensive, and there's no way you can be outframed if you look at different contexts. Yep. And there are like, this is the final slide. So tiering analysis, this is, you can see that's done in loads of different ways. And I gave you loads of examples of how it can be done. This is not like the end all and be all. There's loads of other ways you can tier in analysis. For example, second order impacts. So lots of impacts have secondary impacts. So for example, if it's something like racial quotas in universities, sure, you have a very initial impact of just like, hey, more minorities now get into university, but also just like the secondary impacts of that, which is that, you know, like when you have like minorities going to university and graduating, their children statistically are shown to be more willing to go to university if their parents have. So a big problem is just that loads of minorities or underrepresented people don't go to university because they feel like university is not for them or is not for people like them. Now that when you have like more like families that are from underrepresented backgrounds going to university, you no longer have that idea that it's not for you because your parents went to university, and you're just more likely going to go to university because it's what your parents did. So it seems like a safer option. So that's a secondary impact. So you can tier your analysis such that you give like one really easily provable impact that just seems so intuitive and obvious. They can just branch off into many secondary impacts and just analyze that those happen. Just like I did right there. And then the last way I'll tell you how to tier your analysis is the short-term and long-term. So you can also think about how emotion operates over lots of different time scales. So for example, the motion may be about forcing media companies to have more minority representation. You can just say like, yeah, sure, just like surely like now, like the short term is that you just have a lot more minorities on television. That's really good because like, you know, people like to see themselves reflected on television. But you know, in the long term, that's where it really matters. Long term, you have children growing up watching these television programs and they see minorities in a diverse set of roles in all of society. And because of this, they feel like they can be a lawyer, they feel like they can be a doctor, they feel like they can be an actress, even when social stigma often traditionally tells them they can't be those things. And so any questions whatsoever? This is super complicated stuff. I don't expect you to do this perfectly straight away, but anytime you're making an argument and you find yourself only having like one mechanism, try to think about all the things I told you. Try to see like what people are motivated by, different incentives, different actors involved in emotion, different contexts. Maybe like one problem has multiple reasons as to why it arises, and you can look at how this motion addresses every one of those roots. Yeah, so just like don't be completely put off by it. This is a thing that you become naturalized to as you do more and more debate. So if you're confused, don't feel put off. It's something that comes with practice. But yeah, so I thought this was just a really good way of articulating how I matter dump and how I have really strong linear flow. And hopefully this is useful to most of you. Any questions? If not, I'll be checking the chat as well. Maybe that's a good idea. If not, I'm going to stop recording and we can start the debate. Awesome.